My name is Kira Ventris. I'm 33 years old, and I'm a visual communication designer. I've long grown accustomed to neatly tucking away my emotions at dining tables that look like warm family gatherings, but are actually riddled with subtle, calculated tensions. I've returned to Santa Fe solely to attend my father Zeno's 27th wedding anniversary dinner, a family show that I can't possibly escape. The old house still looks exactly as it did in my memories. Warm light spills over the intricately carved wooden sideboard, yet it can't quite penetrate the thick silence hanging in the air. The guests' smiles are as precise as if molded by a template, every curve of their eyes perfectly calibrated. My stepmother, Isolde, was born in Portugal. Her accent is like a treasured antique lace, soft yet subtly aloof. Whenever she feels inclined, she switches effortlessly into Portuguese, erecting an invisible wall between us. Over the years, that wall has kept me firmly on the outside. The dinner begins amid feigned laughter and the crisp clink of glasses. Layla, my half-sister, leaned toward Isolde, her voice soft as cream yet laced with a sharpness as icy as crushed ice. Then, in clear, confident Portuguese, she said, "She only puts on airs. Actually, she's good for nothing." Father Zeno let out a low chuckle, and Isolde nodded subtly, as if perfectly in sync. They thought this secret language could keep me forever shut out of their world, but they couldn't have been more mistaken. I didn't flinch. My fingertips clung to the cool rim of the tall glass, my knuckles turning pale, yet remaining as steady as a rock. My instincts were screaming at me to expose them right then and there, but in the end, I merely lifted a faint smile, a smile that concealed both suppressed fury and a power poised to erupt. Years of being dismissed and overlooked had taught me the sharpest weapon of all. Silence often carries far more piercing force than words ever could. That night, deep within my heart, I made a vow. Never again would their whispered secrets define my worth. They don't know. I understood every single word they said. Even less do they realize that this silence will one day exact a heavy price from them, unaware that my Portuguese has long since reached perfection. So I decided to give them a lesson they'd never forget. Before the story begins, why don't you tell me? What time is it where you are right now? Where are you watching this from? And which city are you in? I want to know just how far this long-buried memory has drifted. The next morning, the old house was so quiet it felt almost eerie, almost as if even the walls were holding their breath, hiding secrets of their own. Every family has an invisible hierarchy, and in ours, that hierarchy had been deeply entrenched ever since Father Zeno remarried. When I was 6 years old, Father Zeno, a founder of a well-known architectural firm, married Isolde, the woman who would later become my stepmother. To this day, I still remember the ochre cliffs of Santa Fe, the pale purple silk dress she wore, and the way she called out her father's name, as if it were the most precious word in the world. Everyone said she was Zeno's destined partner, yet I could never quite grasp what that perfect match really meant. A few months later, Isolde became pregnant, and my father's joy flooded the entire house like an incoming tide. Meanwhile, I had completely lost the central place I once held. He painted the nursery himself, a soft, gentle goose yellow, and the smile on his face was brighter than anything I'd ever seen before. When my half-sister Layla was born, Isolde's Portuguese relatives crowded into our home, filling the air with the sweet aroma of Portuguese custard tarts and the delicate scent of lavender. I couldn't understand a word they said, yet I felt acutely how out of place I was. They'd give me a polite little smile, then turn around and switch effortlessly to Portuguese, chatting and laughing among themselves, while my father, Zeno, simply pretended not to notice. Growing up in this home felt like being forced to constantly switch between two channels, English and Portuguese. At breakfast, I'd enthusiastically talk about my art class at school, while Isolde would chat with my father in Portuguese, her words forming an impenetrable wall that kept me firmly on the outside. My father would nod occasionally, offering a few perfunctory responses in English, then quickly glance at me, as if hoping I'd simply vanish into thin air. But all my emotions, all my awareness, I quietly tucked away deep inside myself. Layla became the absolute center of this household. Isolde doted on her endlessly, and even my father, Zeno, obeyed her every wish. They called her our little star, and gradually, I began to understand that every compliment they paid her was, in fact, a silent dismissal of me. I was the sensible one, the easygoing one. These seemingly gentle labels were, in reality, cold expressions of detachment. Isolde's kindness always carried a sharp edge. She'd pretend to praise my design drafts, only to later advise me to find a stable clerical job. She'd sigh over how too independent I was, implying nothing more than, "You'll have to rely on yourself. We're not going to help you." My father, Zeno, never once contradicted her. He'd simply smile, take her hand gently, and then quickly change the subject. At the time, I naively thought this was what love was all about, but only when I grew older did I realize it was nothing but cowardly evasion. By the time I was a teenager, I'd long since figured out the silent rules of our home. When Zeno came home tired from the architectural firm, Isolde would first switch to Portuguese and then subtly probe him about the company's financial situation. When she got angry, she'd lock herself in her room and mutter under her breath in low, muffled Portuguese. And whenever distant relatives called, she'd retreat to a corner of the garden, speaking in an urgent, deliberately hushed tone. I couldn't understand those words, yet I could keenly sense that they concealed decisions that had nothing to do with me but nonetheless profoundly affected my life. My father always covered it all up with pale excuses. You know, when your stepmother's under a lot of stress, she just acts this way. Gradually, I stopped asking him to translate for me because every time I did, he'd sigh impatiently, saying, "It doesn't matter." And yet, precisely those things he dismissed as not important were slowly shaping the course of my life. Layla never had to ask anything herself. She switched effortlessly between two languages, mastering both the conveniences that privilege brought and the subtle art of winning adult approval. By the time she was 10, she'd already begun deliberately mimicking Isolde's graceful posture and her covert arrogance. When guests came over, she'd sit obediently beside her father, translating for him from Portuguese, with a smile so perfectly flawless that it seemed to declare to the whole world, "I'm the real master of this house." But I could only sit at the other end of the dining table, pretending not to notice any of it. At the age of 16, I happened to overhear Isolde whispering to Layla from the corner of the terrace. In Portuguese, she softly urged her, "You've got to always be better than her. This world remembers only the winners." Layla let out a soft laugh, a laugh laced with smug satisfaction. In that moment, I finally understood once and for all that, from childhood until now, I'd been nothing more than a reference point, a mere tool used to highlight Layla's excellence, rather than my father's true daughter. My father, Zeno, had never noticed any of this. He'd always revolved around Isolde's moods, mistaking feigned calmness for love. "Your stepmother means well," he'd constantly reassure me. "You and Layla will one day grow close." But in this house, love was always conditional. Mastery of Portuguese, absolute obedience, and tacit silence. When I left home to go to college, Isolde gave me my first hug. Her arms were cold and distant. "You're such a strong girl," she said. "Don't forget to write to your father. Not to us, but to him." I'd thought distance would soften it all, but it turned out I'd been way too naive. When I came home for the holidays, nothing had changed. The same dining table, the same two languages spoken, the same familiar division of roles, Isolde and Layla chatting away happily, Zeno smiling and chiming in now and then, while I pretended I was just a guest in this house. One Christmas, Layla flipped through my portfolio of design work and laughed derisively. "You're still making these impractical things? Dad says if you'd just settled down a bit, you could have gotten an internship at his architecture firm." I didn't say a word, my fingers clutching tightly at the hem of my shirt. Isolde stepped over with a glass of red wine, her smile smooth and soothing. "Honey, she's got real artistic talent, but not everyone is cut out for the commercial world." This time, she deliberately used English, making sure I could understand her perfectly. At the moment, all I felt was profound irony. Here was a woman who was fluent in two languages, yet with those very same languages, she kept reminding me again and again, "You don't belong here." As soon as I stepped into the room, their laughter would come to an abrupt halt. Layla would give me a scornful glance, a look that seemed to say, "You'll never understand our world." And she was right. I really didn't understand it, nor did I care to. Years later, when I founded my own visual communication design studio, my father Zeno congratulated me with a tone of astonishment. "Great job, Chila. You actually did it." His voice was laced with surprise, as if my success were somehow unbelievable. Layla sent me a text message. "Congratulations." No punctuation, no emotion, cold and robotic like text generated by a machine. Isoil didn't say a word, almost as if my achievements had nothing to do with her at all. That's what my family is like. Affection must be weighed carefully. Truth needs to be sugar-coated, and recognition is always delayed. We all live trapped in fragments, half praise, half perfunctory gestures, half acceptance, half rejection, half warmth, half indifference. And I, caught between these fragments, have somehow managed to keep on living, struggling against the odds. Looking back now, I suddenly realize that silence isn't passive submission. It's a silent form of resistance. Every time I've held back the urge to argue, every time I've maintained an outward calm, I've been refusing to play along with their meticulously crafted game. They think I'm docile and obedient, mistaking my patience for weakness and vulnerability. But in this home divided by words, silence has become my most powerful weapon, a translator that helps me decode their hypocrisy. I learned to keep quiet, not because I agreed with their actions, but because silence allowed me to observe more safely and to gather my strength with greater composure. The night after the memorial dinner, the old house was thick with the scent of rosemary and intrigue. The kitchen countertops were covered with lit candles, soft jazz music flowed gently through the room, and the clinking of glasses echoed across the marble floor. Isolde moved like a director who had everything under control, calmly directing every detail with deliberate grace, each gesture both elegant and calculated, as if she were performing a perfectly choreographed family drama. Standing by the window, I pretended to be engrossed in my phone, but in reality, I kept a close watch out of the corner of my eye, intently following her and Layla as they arranged floral arrangements at the dining table. Their voices were low and intimately synchronized, seamlessly switching between Portuguese, a wall of sound that I should never have been able to understand, yet now seemed as clear as a whispered secret right beside my ear. Isolde spoke softly in Portuguese. "We need to update the account information for the family trust." Layla nodded and handed her a folded piece of paper. Then, those words that sent a chill straight through my body, came pouring out. "Zeno doesn't need to know this account exists." I froze instantly. The warmth seemed to drain from my fingertips. The words were uttered casually, yet they felt like a cold dagger, piercing right through what little hope I'd held on to. I shifted slightly, still pretending to scroll through my phone screen, and through the reflection on the window glass, I clearly saw them exchanging glances. The family trust was Father Zeno's life's work, a family legacy he took immense pride in, symbolizing transparency and accountability. But those 5 simple words, "doesn't need to know," had turned it into a dark secret, a tool wielded solely for personal gain. Without giving away a single emotion, I placed my phone on the counter and adjusted its angle just right, so that the camera could perfectly capture their every move and conversation. Then, Layla let out a soft chuckle and said in a tone laced with mockery, "Kira is just like her mother, Rowena. She only knows how to play to the crowd and seek everyone's attention." Her voice was sweetly saccharine, yet bitterly cutting, like candy coated in poison. Isolde didn't retort. Instead, she quietly whispered in Portuguese, "Don't speak so loudly. Watch out that someone might overhear." The two exchanged a knowing smile, one that carried not a trace of warmth, but rather the unspoken understanding born of long-term collusion. My throat tightened, and the long-suppressed fury began to burn fiercely in my chest. For years, I deliberately turned a blind eye to their whispers and exclusion, but this one remark, slandering my mother Rowena, felt like a blade piercing straight into my heart. What exactly did Layla mean? What could my mother have possibly done to deserve such vicious slander? Without a second thought, I immediately hit the record button. Though my hands trembled slightly with anger, I managed to keep my composure. They kept talking about account transfers and the timing of signatures. Isolde spoke with absolute certainty, clearly having planned this all along. Layla said triumphantly, "Dad totally trusts you. Just give him a little sweet talk and he'll sign anything." Isolde laughed in response. "That's exactly why everything has gone so smoothly." I fought hard to suppress the urge to expose them right there and then. The silent retaliation was far more powerful than any outburst. I listened quietly until the end, realizing that the truth about our family was hidden in another language altogether, a conspiracy cloaked in the guise of family harmony. As soon as they headed toward the pantry, I took the opportunity to slip away, grabbed my phone, and hurried back to my room. Once I was safely in my room, I immediately played back the recording. The voices. Zeno doesn't need to know about this account, and Kira is just like her mom, Rowena, always seeking attention, came through crystal clear. Every single syllable felt like a needle piercing straight into my heart. I think of my mother, who left when I was 5. Everyone said she'd grown tired of the elite lifestyle and was seeking freedom, but what if that was a lie? What if she'd been pushed aside by Isolde and abandoned by my father? Suddenly, the image of her leaving became crystal clear. She was crouching in front of me, urging me to take good care of myself. Her suitcase sat by the door, and in the sunlight, she struggled to hold back her tears. She glanced at me just once before turning away and walking off without looking back. Back then, I thought she'd simply grown weary of our family, but now I realize perhaps she'd been running away all along. I dug out my mother's phone number, which had been tucked away for over a decade. 3 years ago, on her birthday, she sent me a congratulatory text message that I'd never replied to. After hesitating for what felt like an eternity, I finally pressed the call button. After 3 rings, a voice, familiar yet strangely unfamiliar, came through. "Kula? Is that you, sweetheart?" My throat tightened as I replied, "Mom, it's been so long." She immediately asked anxiously if something had happened. I whispered softly, "I heard something I shouldn't have. Isolde and Layla were talking about Dad, about the trust fund, and they even mentioned you." The line went dead, plunging the other end into a heavy silence, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. When she spoke again, her voice carried an urgency and solemnity I'd never heard before. "Kyla, there's something I have to tell you. There's a truth I've been too afraid to tell you all along." "What truth?" I asked urgently. "It's hard to explain over the phone. It's just too dangerous." Her voice trembled slightly. "Let's meet tomorrow. A coffee shop by the river in Minneapolis, the very one we used to go to when you were a kid." I was about to ask more, but she cut me off abruptly. "Trust me, Kyla. Once we meet tomorrow, you'll understand everything." Then she hung up. I held the phone in my hand, staring blankly for what felt like an eternity. The light on the screen flickered faintly, and the recording kept looping, replaying those vicious words, those filthy conspiracies, each time echoing louder and louder through the room. Laughter from Isolde and Layla drifted up from downstairs, along with their voices, speaking in Portuguese as they discussed the details of the next evening's dinner, as if nothing had ever happened. I imagined my father, Zeno, down there, smiling to himself, completely unaware of it all, still immersed in the false happiness of family harmony. The thought shattered something deep inside me, not anger, but a fierce determination. This time, I was no longer that little girl who could only endure silently, no longer an outsider hiding behind doors, eavesdropping on their conversations. I was a witness to their conspiracy, a guardian of the truth. I saved the recording, named the file The Trust Fund Conspiracy, then opened my suitcase and began packing my things. No matter what my mother, Rowena, had to tell me, no matter how many secrets Isolde and Layla were still hiding, tomorrow I would uncover them all, one by one. That night, I stayed awake all through the long hours, no longer afraid of the truth or the conspiracy. After sorting through my past, I made up my mind to finally meet the mother whom I'd both resented and missed so deeply. Early the next morning, I drove out of Santa Fe toward Minneapolis, my phone set to silent, my heart filled with questions about why my mother had left me. By the time I arrived, it was already dark, and my mother, Rowena, was already waiting for me at the riverside cafe she'd often visited as a child. When she saw me, she rose to her feet, her expression complex, mixed with guilt and unease, and softly called out, "Kyla, you're here." "You're the one who asked me to come," I replied calmly. "You said there was a truth you needed to tell me." We sat facing each other in silence, the air heavy with tension. Taking a deep breath, my mother began to speak. "What you've heard is the conspiracy Isolde has been plotting for over a decade." She recalled that, before their divorce, she discovered funds from Zenos's firm being transferred into Isolde's account. When she'd questioned this, she'd been falsely accused of theft. What's more, Isolde had managed to convince Zenos that she was motivated solely by greed, and within less than a month, he'd kicked her out of the house and seized control of both the trust fund and part of the law firm's operations. "Why didn't you refute it?" I asked angrily. She replied that Isolde had hired lawyers to destroy the evidence, and she herself was powerless to gather any proof. She could only keep hold of the crucial documents. As she spoke, she took out a yellowed envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a contract stamped with the law firm's seal and signed by Zeno, proving that a huge sum of money had been transferred into her personal overseas account. The witness was a distant relative of hers who also worked at the bank. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" I asked. She choked back tears and said, "You were only 5 years old then. I didn't want you to grow up living in hatred. And when you got older, I was afraid you wouldn't be able to accept that your father had been deceived all along. Zeno wasn't a bad person. He was just weak and easily fooled by appearances. I'm tired of this constant fighting." I asked my mother if leaving had been about protecting herself. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It was even more about protecting you. Isolde would stop at nothing. If I'd stayed, you'd have become her bargaining chip." In that moment, the resentment in my heart began to melt away, leaving only deep sympathy and sorrow for her. My mother felt utterly guilty and urged me not to confront Isolde directly. "She and Layla are both cunning and calculating," she said. "We'll need much stronger evidence before we can take on either of them." "I've already recorded evidence of their conspiracy," I told her. At first, my mother was surprised, then she smiled with relief. "You're so much stronger than I was back then." "I'll make their actions boomerang right back on them," I said. My mother felt both proud and worried. "Back then, I was so blinded by anger that I ended up leaving in a mess. You've got to be extra careful. These women won't give up easily." "Isolde will definitely seek revenge," I replied firmly. "I know, but I'm not going to back down." We spent the entire afternoon confiding in each other at a cafe. My mother gave me contact information for several key people, an accountant who used to work at my father's firm, and an old employee who'd been pushed aside by Isolde. Both of them had evidence proving Isolde's manipulation of finances, but back then, they'd been pressured into keeping quiet. "These people might be able to help you, but be careful not to let Isolde catch on," she warned. By the time we left, the rain had stopped, and the sky was clearing up. As I headed out, my mother reminded me, "When you see Zeno, don't blame him too harshly. He's not your enemy. He's just been misled for too long. His greatest weakness is his own weakness." I nodded, jotting it down, and whispered a soft thank you. "Thanks for telling me the truth. Thanks for not letting me remain in the dark," she said through tears. "Promise me, you won't let their hatred change you. You won't become just like them." "I promise," I said. "I'm not coming back to seek revenge. I'm here only to uncover the truth, give you the answers you deserve, and put an end to all this." That evening, I drove back to Santa Fe, the envelope containing copies of the contract resting on the passenger seat, bolstering my resolve. The illusory happiness Isolde and Layla had built upon lies would finally be dismantled by my own hands. At the anniversary dinner, the old mansion was lavishly decorated, its air thick with the effervescence of champagne and insincere smiles. Guests crowded around, most of them father's business partners, family friends, and social climbers eager to curry favor with the powerful. Isolde wore an emerald green silk gown, basking in the praise, while Layla donned the same pale green dress, flaunting her role as the event's mastermind and touting family unity. I stood in the corner, dressed in a deep blue evening gown, silently observing with an expression as calm and unruffled as still water. My partner, Karen, pretended to be checking the sound system while secretly manipulating the computer, waiting for the signal. "Are you ready?" he whispered through his wireless earpiece. "Just wait for Layla's cue. The timing is crucial," I replied. At 8 p.m., Layla took the stage to deliver her speech, thanking the guests and announcing that a video tribute to her parents would be shown next. The lights dimmed, and the screen first displayed warm, heartwarming family photos, completely mesmerizing the guests. I gave Karen a secret hand signal, and immediately he acted on it. The screen suddenly switched to a series of transaction records from the family trust fund. The room fell utterly silent in an instant. Then, the wire transfer record appeared, clearly labeled, "Transferor, Isolde Ferreira," with the amount highlighted in bright red. Layla's face turned deathly pale, and she screamed at the top of her lungs, trying to turn off the screen, but Karen had already locked the device. Isolde's body began to tremble uncontrollably, her eyes wide with sheer terror. The screen kept playing evidence, account signatures, financial flows, and other damning proof, clearly demonstrating that she had embezzled public funds for her own personal gain. Her father, utterly shocked, leapt to his feet, his voice trembling as he confronted Isolde. But Isolde was speechless, unable to reply. Layla lunged toward the projector again, and the guests had already begun whispering among themselves. The room descended into utter chaos. I stepped forward slowly, my high-heeled shoes echoing over the growing din. "You say I'm worthless? My silence has been nothing but watching you destroy yourselves." I continued, speaking calmly yet firmly, laying bare the truth. "All the family legacy and charitable deeds you've so proudly flaunted, they're nothing but a sham, built on the misappropriation of the trust fund. That fund was your father's life's work, yet it's become nothing more than a tool for you to enrich yourselves and feed your vanity." Isolde screamed in denial, but I pointed directly at the evidence displayed on the screen. My father tried to calm me down, but I replied with deep disappointment. "You always say the truth must be faced, and that those who do wrong must pay the price. But today, I'm here precisely to make them pay." On the screen appeared, at last, a transfer document stamped with timestamps, bearing the joint signatures of Isolde and Layla. The room erupted in gasps, then fell utterly silent. I raised my glass and said to them, "To your perfect facade, remember the jarring sound it'll make when it shatters." Then I gestured for Karen to turn off the projection. As the lights came on, the guests' shock and disdain were plain to see. Reporters had already begun covering the story on the scene. Isolde swayed unsteadily, trying to defend herself by saying, "It was all for the sake of the family." I sneered back at her, "For the sake of the family? So you embezzled public funds, slandered my mother, and incited Layla to lie? Don't you dare wrap your greed and malice in the guise of familial duty." She was left speechless. Karen and I turned and walked away. Behind us, the clinking of glasses became the mournful wail of our family's shattered reputation. The next day, the old mansion was besieged by reporters. A key partner at my father's firm resigned, publicly distancing himself from the affair. Isolde's sponsors suspended their collaborations and began demanding repayment of funds. The scandal made headlines across financial news outlets. Bold. Isolde stayed locked in her room, while Layla frantically pounded away at the piano, trying to escape reality. The old mansion was filled with panic and despair. I watched it all quietly. Years of lies and rejection had finally been overwhelmed by the very despair they'd created themselves. My father, looking utterly exhausted in his office, asked me if the truth was indeed real. I told him the evidence was irrefutable, including audio recordings. He burst into tears, overcome with remorse, and admitted that he'd failed to heed his wife, Rowena's, warnings back then. His stubborn obsession with peace had destroyed our family and scarred my childhood. Faced with his questioning, I made it clear that this wasn't about revenge. It was simply about uncovering the truth, seeking justice, and putting an end to the chaos. When asked about my plans moving forward, I stated unequivocally that I would leave Santa Fe and return to my studio in Tucson, no longer involved in the conflict, no longer trying to mend a broken family. Some things, once shattered, can never be restored. I'm not going to fix something I didn't break. With that, the conversation ended and I turned around, walking out of the office. Father didn't try to stop me. He just sat quietly, staring at that old photograph. The scorching desert heat of Santa Fe hit me full in the face, shattering every last illusion. As I walked past the courtyard corners that had once been filled with false happiness, I'd barely reached the driveway when Layla burst out, her hair disheveled and her eyes swollen and red, screaming at me, "You're the one who destroyed this home! You're nothing but a curse!" I stopped dead in my tracks and calmly replied, "This home was already ruined by your greed and lies. I'm merely bringing the truth to light. You're reaping what you've sown. You're the ones who brought this upon yourselves. I'm just exposing the truth." With that, I got into my car and drove away from the old house. Outside the window, the rust-colored desert churned with swirling dust, while the sky stretched wide and all-encompassing. My phone vibrated, signaling an incoming call from Father. I didn't answer. After the call disconnected on its own, I immediately deleted his number. In my heart, there was no anger or resentment, not even a trace of it. All I felt was relief. Mother's words echoed in my mind. Some roots are rotten from the very beginning. They're not worth watering. Yeah, the definition of family has shifted, from being tied by blood to being rooted in respect and care. For years, I'd been trying to fit into that family, but only now do I realize that I'd already put down my own roots amidst their coldness, finding my own sunshine and fertile soil. As the city lights faded into the distance, the desert unfolded before me, brimming with the fresh scent of new beginnings. Finally, I was able to shed my masks, let go of the past, and find inner peace. 6 months later, I'm running a visual communication design studio in Tucson's Old Town. The sign above the door, Wentris Thorne Creative Design Studio, was Karen's idea, symbolizing our collaboration and my fresh start. Though the studio is small, business is booming. We've taken on local projects like brand design for independent bookstores and packaging for bakeries, filling me with a deep sense of accomplishment. At last, I can freely pursue what I truly love. Karen isn't just my partner, she's also my closest friend, always calmly helping me sort through my thoughts. He bluntly told me that my former silence was a form of self-protection, while today's calmness is my true nature, and reminded me that I no longer need to be held captive by silence. Occasionally, I'd hear bits and pieces about Santa Fe. Isolde had been charged with embezzlement and business fraud, and Layla, dragged into the scandal, had been ostracized and eventually left. My father's architectural firm had scaled down its operations due to the scandal, and he'd sold the family home to move to a small town, leaving him in a state of financial decline. Now and then, I'd think of my father, and all that remained in my heart was a faint sense of melancholy. His weakness had cost him dearly, but there was no point dwelling on past regrets anymore. I'd learned to make peace with the past and let go of responsibilities that weren't mine to bear. One morning, the studio received an email from a new client, a family-run bakery located in Tucson's Old Town. They wanted to completely redesign their brand image, including the logo, packaging, and store decor. In the email, the client wrote, "We've seen your work, and we feel that your designs carry a genuine power. We hope our bakery can convey that same feeling," I said, staring at the words, "the power of sincerity," for a long time. Sincerity, a quality that had been so scarce in my life until now, a trait I'd once regarded as a weakness, had now become my most precious treasure. That afternoon, after she left, I sat at my desk and wrote a letter of gratitude to the bakery, the very first official client I'd ever had. It wasn't just a thank you note for their business. It was a declaration, penned in a voice that finally felt truly mine. "They used language to keep me at arm's length," I wrote in my diary that night. "I used silence to set myself free." Outside the studio window, the moon rose, casting a pale, vast glow against Phoenix's skyline. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and stood for a moment in the light of my new life. No anger, no noise, only calm humming softly, like a song only I can hear. When your family betrays you, the truth becomes your only legacy. Thanks for listening until the end. Let me know in the comments what the truth means to you.